What happens when the fears you brush off come to life? Can video games really change a person more than we think? In the case of Daniel Petric, this might be possible. Daniel lived a normal life until the way he lived was changed forever. With emotional and psychological damage outside of his control, or the events of his life within his control or forced upon him by an outside force. Welcome back to another episode of Ripshire Crime. This is the tragic story of Daniel Petric. Daniel Petric, a boy nicknamed Danny, was born and raised in Brighton Township, a charter township of Livingston County in the U.S. state of Michigan. His father, Mark, was a Pentecostal minister in Wellington at the New Life Assembly of God, and his mother was named Susan Petric. Daniel also had an older sister, Heidi, who he had a good relationship with growing up. They had their differences, but they were still close and shared a sibling bond. According to Daniel's father, he had a loving relationship with both of his parents, and they rarely got into arguments that couldn't be solved in just a matter of hours. People who knew the family described them as ordinary, without any apparent issues in the household. Daniel's friends and family portrayed him as a normal and happy teenager, without any psychological problems or issues that his parents worried about. They had a lot of close friends in the town and knew most of the families of Daniel's friends and schoolmates. Brighton is a small town with a population of less than 20,000 people. The town has a beautiful historic district in the downtown core and is known for being a safe, family-friendly place where children grow up in close-knit circles and with friends they'll have for life. For more families, this is exactly what they experienced here. However, Daniel actually attended high school in Wellington, Ohio, but even here, he didn't have much of a hard time making friends. Students often described him as friendly and fun to be around, and he shared hobbies with a lot of the kids that he studied with. Fellow churchgoers pointed out that he was enthusiastic about the Bible and was an active part of their small and closely connected community, just like the other members of his family. He had a typical school background, with no necessarily special achievements, but without any big trouble either, which is more than some of his other classmates could say. Most people in town knew of him or his family, and everyone perceived him as being pretty similar to everyone else around. Nothing about them stood out. They were as normal could be. However, all of this changed very quickly, and in ways the Petric family or any other family could have never predicted. While on a water skiing trip, Daniel contracted a staphylococcus infection after a skiing accident and was housebound for over a year in order to heal. He had suffered severe spinal damage that completely changed the way he lived and could take care of himself. And he was also ordered to take various medications throughout the day that forced him to change his schedule in order to follow a new routine. He couldn't leave the house often and could barely take care of himself without assistance from his parents. Because of this, he was forced to spend more time at home than ever, and he found ways to entertain himself without being active. During this period of recovery, Daniel was introduced to the Halo video game series by his friend, Jonathan Johnson. It was during this time that Daniel's obsession with video games began and grew into something his family hated. He would play them for hours on end, sometimes up to 18 hours a day, with Jonathan. Halo was a series of violent games centered around a war with aliens, most of them rated as mature for adult audiences by the ESRB, where the player's goal is to destroy all alien life. Daniel's father, Mark, disapproved of video game violence and was noticeably unhappy when his son started to play all day, thinking it would change who he was if he sat in front of a screen all day long. After his son expressed his desire to buy the Halo games for himself, rather than just play at his friend's house, Daniel's father ordered him to stop playing the games or leave the house altogether. Daniel temporarily moved into Johnson's house for a weekend to continue playing the game with his friend against his parents' wishes. It was this decision that set the stage for a tragic chain of events and completely changed the family's lives forever. The addiction to the game reached a point where it became a source of conflict within the Petric family. It escalated so far that they could barely spend time together without arguing anymore, since Daniel was so upset about not being able to play the game at home. and since Daniel was at the house almost all day when he wasn't over at Jonathan's, the tension was rising. Mark's concerns about the violence in the video games clashed with his son's growing obsession, and neither of them was willing to negotiate their stance or come to some sort of conclusion. The situation escalated yet again when Daniel went out to purchase the game for himself one night, even though he was under stern orders from his parents not to do so. When he arrived home and was caught red-handed by his father, it was immediately confiscated from him. Mark thought he was doing what was best for his son, hoping to help him recreate his life and get onto a better path outside of video games. This confiscation, however, only intensified Daniel's desire to play the game, even if it had to be behind his parents' backs. He became determined to regain possession of it, and he didn't mind if it meant resorting to unthinkable measures. All he could focus on was getting the game back. Around 7 p.m. on October 20th, 2007, approximately 1 week after the game had been confiscated, Daniel took a drastic step. He had been furious for the entire week now, hoping every day that his father would finally allow him to make decisions for himself and return to the game. But every day, they argued over it, and his father refused to give it back. Since playing it almost every day since his accident, it only made him angrier the longer his father refused to let him. It's unclear whether Daniel decided on what he was going to do next, or if he acted in the heat of the moment when his emotions were at the highest. On this evening, Daniel found his father's key to unlock the safe that held both the Halo game and a 9mm Taurus PT-92 handgun. He knew this was where his father had locked the game, but the other objects found in the drawer also interested him. Not only did Daniel take the game, but he took the gun as well. With the stolen game and the gun in his possession, Daniel embarked on a path that would lead to an unthinkable act of violence against his own family. On that fateful evening, Daniel's parents were spending time together in the family room. Daniel was off on his own, as he usually was. Just after 7 p.m., Daniel approached his parents, who were seated on a couch. In a chillingly calm voice, he uttered the words, "Would you close your eyes? I have a surprise for you." The unsuspecting parents complied, believing their son was planning a harmless surprise. After all, they were trying to mend the relationship with him, regardless of the constant arguments over the video game. But what followed was a horrifying betrayal of trust. In a matter of seconds, the tranquility of their living room was shattered by gunshots. The once loving son had turned into a cold-blooded assailant, firing at his own parents with merciless determination. It was a scene of unimaginable horror and disbelief. Daniel shot multiple times at both parents. When he decided he was finished and believed he had taken both their lives, Daniel placed the weapon in his father's hand, attempting to stage the crime as a murder-suicide. Both his parents lay bleeding in the living room. The chilling words he spoke to his father, "Hey Dad, here's your gun. Take it," only deepened the horror of the situation. As the shock of the initial attack settled in, Daniel was quickly deciding what his next step needed to be. He was deciding between running and leaving the bodies behind, or staying to clean up what he had done. Daniel thought he had more time alone in the house, but another layer of tragedy would soon be revealed. Just minutes later, Daniel's sister, Heidi, and her husband, Andrew Archer, arrived at the house. They had planned to come by and watch the baseball game with their parents, but they had no idea what they were about to walk into. Heidi and Andrew arrived 2 hours earlier than expected, cutting into Daniel's plans to clean up the scene alone. This disrupted Daniel's carefully laid plan to stage the crime and escape undetected. Seeing them pull into the driveway, Daniel knew he needed to act quickly and change plans and come up with another way to divert his sister until he could complete what he had planned. Before Heidi and Andrew could enter the house, Daniel first tried to dissuade them, falsely claiming that his parents were engaged in a heated argument and hoping they would decide to leave entirely or come back later. However, Heidi and Andrew could hear sounds of groaning and distress from within the house, forcing them to enter against Daniel's will and see what was going on for themselves. Concerned for their parents' well-being and hearing what sounded like horrible noises, they forced their way into the house and ran toward the living room where it was coming from. Heidi was taken aback by what she was greeted to on her way in. which was nothing she could have expected. Inside her family living room, her parents lay wounded, blood staining the floor around them and quickly pooling up. Fortunately, Heidi realized one parent was still breathing. Her mother was wounded, enough that it looked like they were just too late to help her though. But her father, Mark, was breathing, barely gasping for air, but still alive. Heidi, overcome by mixed feelings of grief, frantically called 911 to report what she was seeing. Her voice trembled with incomprehensible urgency as she reported that her parents had been shot and the perpetrator was none other than her brother, Daniel, who had just left the house. As the chaos unfolded, Daniel seized the opportunity to escape when he believed he was least likely to be noticed. Daniel fled the house in the family minivan, leaving behind a scene of devastation and despair as his sister was still inside. But his desperate escape would be short-lived as the police were not far away and knew exactly what car he was driving, thanks to Heidi. Heidi reported the make, model, and plate of the car Daniel had fled the family house in. But beyond this, his erratic driving as he left the home caught the attention of the police. His reckless driving and manic demeanor on the road raised alarms, and it was clear whoever was behind the wheel was either running from something or intoxicated. He could be heard shouting, "My dad shot my mom," as he sped away from the scene of the crime. However, even as he fled, Daniel couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Police swiftly set up roadblocks to intercept him, already knowing which direction he was heading, and his reckless flight came to an abrupt end. It's believed that Daniel called his friend after committing the murders and told him what happened, that he was on his way to his house. Daniel was forced out of the minivan and placed under arrest, but his strange and contradictory statements only added to the mysteries surrounding the events of that evening. Daniel had clearly created a plan to get out of the murders without taking responsibility for what he had done. When they caught him, Daniel had his copy of Halo 3 on the passenger seat beside him, which raised many eyebrows. As he was being taken into custody, Daniel repeatedly made the same allegation, asking about the well-being of his father, Mark. Strangely, he also added a plea to the act. "Lord, please don't let my dad die." These words uttered in the midst of chaos and tragedy hinted at the conflicted emotions that must have been racing through his mind. No one knows whether he was truly upset or if this was all an act to portray remorse for what he had done. However, even though he claimed to have no role in the murder, he also gave no reason as to why he left after his sister arrived home to find her parents shot in their own house. The next step in the investigation was to understand what had happened before Heidi showed up. Police began by questioning Daniel about what he had done that day and how his parents ended up shot in their own living room. As the police questioned Daniel about the sequence of events when his sister arrived, he explained that he tried to prevent her from entering the house. Daniel didn't want her to witness the gruesome scene that awaited inside and held on to the story that his father had shot his mother while Daniel was upstairs. The police pressed Daniel for more details about the crime scene, specifically whether or not he was ever in control of the gun, since he claimed he took it out of his father's hands. He admitted to touching the gun after the shootings, but continued to tell the police he had walked in on his father, holding it after shooting his mother. His explanation was that he moved the weapon because he believed his father was still alive and feared he might harm himself further. This act, however, raised more questions than answers, and the police didn't believe Daniel's explanation of the events, where he basically claimed his father had shot himself as well. Daniel didn't go on to give much more details about his side of the story. He never gave reason for why he had the video game on him when he fled the scene, or why he fled the scene at all. These questions had police digging for more information. The layers of deception and conflicting statements were beginning to unravel, making this case more difficult than expected. The police confronted Daniel, expressing their doubts about his version of events. They knew that he had vital information, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would emerge. What Daniel didn't know, as he faced the police relentless questioning, was that his father, Mark Petric, had miraculously survived the gunshot wounds and was recovering in the hospital as he spoke to the police. After waking up, Mark played a major role in telling the police exactly what happened on that dire night, and had a very different story from what Daniel told police. Mark's story also aligned with a more believable motive, that Daniel was upset about them taking away his video game. While Daniel said that his father had shot his mother, almost just out of the blue, the police had no reason to believe this beloved couple, by neighbors, would have such a thing happen. Mark revealed to the police that it was Daniel who had shot both him and Susan when they least expected it. He recounted the harrowing experience of feeling his head go numb as blood poured from his wounds. This was far more than enough for them to press charges against Daniel and bring him to court in front of a judge. Mark would go on to spend weeks in a coma, battling for his own life as he grappled with the physical and emotional aftermath of the attack. His survival would be a pivotal factor in the legal proceedings that followed, and he as a witness played a major role in helping the jury come to a decision about who was responsible for the crimes. The trial that followed the shocking events of that October evening was nothing short of emotionally charged, and it caused more pain to Daniel's surviving father than could be imagined. It spanned from December 15th to the 17th of 2008, held at the Lorain County Court of Common Pleas in Ellery, Ohio. Judge James Burge presided over the proceedings, and a unique decision was made. Daniel opted for a trial without a jury. Approximately 25 young people, including friends and supporters, gathered in the courtroom, which was a testament to the deep shock and disbelief that had enveloped the community. Friends, neighbors, and fellow churchgoers found themselves torn between their affection for the Petric family and the incomprehensible nature of the crime. The Petric family was also an active member of the community before the shooting, and now, others living nearby were unsure what to think of them, and more specifically, what to think of Daniel, whom they had seen grown up with their own children. Throughout the trial, emotional testimonies were delivered by family members, friends, and acquaintances. Each person who took the stand added a layer of complexity to the story, shedding light on Daniel's personality, struggles, and the dynamics within the Petric family. One of the most memorable moments came when Mark Petric himself took the stand. Despite his severe injuries and the trauma he had endured, he displayed strong support for his son and made his testimony about how his son was under the influence of the game, not thinking through his actions as if they were real life. In his statement, Mark announced that Daniel deeply regretted his actions and remained bewildered by the terrible deed he had committed. The father's words resonated with a sense of love and forgiveness that transcended the horrors of that night. The prosecution, hoping to charge Daniel, painted a starkly different picture. They depicted him as a heartless killer who displayed no remorse for his actions. They argued that Daniel had meticulously planned the murder-suicide, selecting a specific time when his sister and her husband were scheduled to arrive. The prosecution's narrative suggested that Daniel's intent had been to stage the crime and make his escape before their arrival. This portrayal of Daniel as a calculating murderer who had carefully plotted the deaths of his parents raised deeply troubling questions. It brought the idea that video games had the ability to cause susceptible teenagers to take actions like this, and causing them to be unable to separate the game from reality. The prosecution argued Daniel was so engaged with the game that he wanted to try it out in real life. In response to the prosecution's arguments, the defense team only partially disagreed with what the prosecution team had to say. Rather than disputing the facts of the crime, they argued for an insanity defense, with the video game addiction at its core. The defense argument sat on the notion that the enormous stress Daniel experienced due to his severe infection and spinal injury had made him highly susceptible to the influence of violent video games. They contended that Daniel's mental state was compromised, preventing him from fully comprehending the gravity and permanence of his actions. In essence, they argued that Daniel, immersed in the virtual world of video games, had lost touch with reality of death. Video games allow players to reset and replay, blurring the lines between life and the game. In this altered state of mind, Daniel may have believed that his mother, Susan, could somehow return to a healthy state, mirroring the resurrection of characters in the video games. The trial became a battle of narratives. one side emphasizing the cold calculation of a planned crime, and the other underscoring the influence of video game addiction and compromised mental state. Daniel's family and friends were called to testify, providing insights into his personality, behavior, and struggles. These testimonies painted a picture of a seemingly ordinary teenager who had succumbed to the grip of addiction. In particular, the defense highlighted that Daniel's addiction was so powerful that he had taken the Halo 3 game with him as he fled the scene, an action that seemed inconceivable to many. According to the defense, this behavior was not that of a calculated murderer, but rather of someone who had acted impulsively under the sway of addiction. After a lengthy and emotionally charged trial, the verdict was finally delivered. Daniel Petric was convicted of aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, and tampering with evidence. Due to his age, he could not receive the death penalty. Instead, the judge handed down a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 23 years, the minimum sentence for such a conviction. This was in contrast to the prosecuting attorney's recommendation of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial's conclusion marked by the end of a deeply traumatic legal battle for all involved, but it also signaled the beginning of a broader conversation about video game addiction and its real potential influence on violence. The Daniel Petric case had far-reaching implications that extended well beyond the courtroom. It ignited discussions and debates about the influence of video game addiction and violent video games on the behavior of young individuals. It also raised questions about the responsibility of the gaming industry to promote healthy gaming habits and provide adequate warnings about potential risks. Microsoft, the publisher of the Halo video game series, issued a brief statement acknowledging the tragic nature of the case. The company, like many others in the gaming industry, was drawn into the larger conversation about the responsibilities and ethical considerations surrounding video game production and distribution. The tragic events of that October evening and the subsequent trial serve as a sobering reminder of the complexities of human behavior and the consequences of unchecked addiction. It challenges us to be vigilant and to recognize the signs of addiction in ourselves and our loved ones, and to seek help and support when it is needed most.